That morning, the courtroom already felt like a verdict waiting to be announced. The air was thick and motionless, the way it gets before something irreversible happens. Every seat was filled. Every face was turned forward. And at the defendant's table, in a chair that felt colder than it had any right to be, sat Vivian Hart, 28 years old, CEO of Hart Biotech, and the woman the entire room had quietly decided was already finished. She wore a red dress, deep crimson, V-neckline, fitted at the shoulders, the kind of outfit a woman chooses when she refuses to look defeated, even when she is. Her blonde hair was pulled back smoothly. Her posture was straight, but anyone close enough to see her eyes could tell she hadn't slept properly in weeks. The precision of her appearance was the last fortress she had left, and she was holding it with everything she had. Hart Biotech had been her father's company before it was hers. Leonard Hart had built it from a converted garage in the early 2000s into one of the most respected names in biotechnology research on the West Coast. When he died, 3 years ago, Vivian was 25. The board expected her to stumble. Instead, she expanded the company's research pipeline, signed 2 landmark licensing agreements, and brought Hart Biotech into the top tier of its industry faster than anyone had predicted. She had done it by being smarter, colder, and more relentless than anyone expected a young woman in that seat to be. And then 3 months ago, the floor had dropped out beneath her. The allegations came all at once: unauthorized transfer of research funds, falsified internal contracts, forged financial approvals, manipulation of budget sign-offs. One by one, documents surfaced, time-stamped, signed with her credentials, neatly organized in folders that painted the picture of a CEO who had been quietly looting the company her father built. The media ran with it immediately. Investors pulled out before the first court date was even set. The stock fell. The board called an emergency session. And Vivian sat through all of it, telling herself and her lawyer that none of it was real, that it would unravel, that the truth would come out on its own. But the truth so far had not cooperated. Her attorney, Andrea Brooks, leaned toward her and whispered that this morning's session was the most critical of the entire proceeding. Andrea was 41, sharp-featured, with the kind of practiced calm that courtrooms demand. But even she looked tight around the jaw. Vivian nodded and said nothing. She already knew. The feeling in the room told her everything she needed to know. The judge entered. The bailiff called the session to order. And across the long stretch of that courtroom, separated from Vivian by nothing but polished wood and devastating circumstance, Martin Keller settled into his chair like a man arriving at a celebration he had organized himself. Martin Keller was 57, and he looked exactly like the kind of man that institutions trust without question. Silver hair, neatly combed. A charcoal suit with the faint texture of money. Hands that rested on the table without fidgeting. When he spoke, his voice carried the unhurried confidence of someone who had already won and was simply completing the formality of proving it. He had been Hart Biotech's chief financial officer for 11 years, longer than Vivian had been in the industry. He had watched her rise, said all the right things to her face, and apparently spent the years beneath that carefully composed surface building something designed to bring her down at the exact moment it would hurt the most. He addressed the court in measured paragraphs, his tone sorrowful in the way that only practiced liars can manage. A man reluctant to expose a colleague, but bound by duty to the company and its shareholders. He produced emails with precise subject lines. He produced transaction records with matching authorization codes. He produced a timeline of decisions that, taken together, made Vivian Hart look like a brilliant woman who had let ambition corrupt her judgment past the point of recovery. Constance Hale, the board's chairwoman at 63, sat 3 rows behind Martin. She had been the first to defend Vivian when the allegations broke. She was not defending her now. She was watching with the expression of a woman who had trusted her instincts and was quietly accepting that she had been wrong. That look, more than any piece of paper on the prosecutor's table, felt like a door closing. Andrea challenged the evidentiary chain as precisely as she could. She flagged inconsistencies in the timestamps, questioned the chain of custody on 2 of the digital files, and forced a re-examination of 3 authorization sequences that didn't quite align. But responses came back clean. Every gap she found had a plausible explanation. Every thread she pulled seemed to reconnect somewhere else. The case against Vivian was constructed like a room with no windows. No matter which wall you pressed, it held. Vivian sat through it all and felt something she hadn't let herself feel before that morning. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter and more final. The sensation of watching someone methodically dismantle the thing your father left in your hands, knowing it was designed to look like your own fault. The man who had done all of this understood more than financial systems. He understood exactly how to destroy a person in the eyes of everyone watching. The janitor started at Hart Biotech the same month the board hired Martin Keller's preferred internal auditor. Nobody made the connection, because nobody ever paid enough attention to the janitorial staff to connect their schedules to anything that mattered. Silas Monroe was 33 years old, and he'd been doing the night shift at Hart Biotech for close to 2 years. He was lean, with a quiet face and the kind of dark eyes that held things longer than most people do. He wore the gray-blue uniform of the building services crew without complaint or commentary, pushed his cart through the corridors after 9 p.m. When the executive floors had cleared out, and did his work with the slow, methodical precision of someone who had decided a long time ago that doing a thing well was reason enough to do it, regardless of who was watching. Nobody was usually watching. He had a daughter named Bonnie who was 6 years old and had her father's eyes and her late mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Every morning before school, Silas made her oatmeal with brown sugar and sliced banana, packed her lunchbox with the same small note, a stick figure drawing, different each day, and walked her to the corner where the school bus came at 7:14. Every evening he drove to Hart Biotech, clocked in at 9:30, and walked the floors until 4 in the morning. He slept while Bonnie was at school. He woke before she got home. He had built a life around that schedule so carefully that its rhythms felt as natural as breathing. His apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that barely fit 2 people side by side. But it was clean. The walls had drawings Bonnie had made, taped up with the kind of pride that children notice and remember. There was a bookshelf with picture books on the bottom 2 shelves and practical manuals on the top. There was a second-hand couch that was more comfortable than it looked, and on Friday nights they watched nature documentaries together until Bonnie fell asleep on his shoulder. His wife had left when Bonnie was 2. She hadn't been cruel about it. She had simply been honest in a way that was, in its own way, more difficult to process. She said she wasn't built for the life they had, and she had gone. Silas had not spent much time being angry about it. He had spent his time being a father, which turned out to be the only thing he was certain he was doing right. At Hart Biotech, he was invisible in the way that building services staff in large corporations always are. Security guards sometimes stopped him at the executive elevator, even though his cleaning assignment covered the finance wing on the 14th floor. Senior staff walked past his cart with the mild irritation of people who find the evidence of cleaning annoying. He did not take it personally. He had learned to understand buildings the way other people learn to understand people, by paying attention to the patterns, the deviations, the small things that didn't add up. It was that habit that changed everything. The night it started was unremarkable until it wasn't. Silas was working the corridor outside the secondary server room on the 14th floor, a climate-controlled space that housed the company's backup data infrastructure, accessible only with senior authorization. His shift usually took him past it twice between 10 p.m. and midnight. The door was always sealed. The hallway was always empty. That night, at 11:47, it wasn't empty. Martin Keller and 2 board members Silas recognized from the company's framed photographs were moving through the hallway using the secondary access panel, not the main entrance which logged every entry to the central security system, but the maintenance override door, which routed access records to a separate administrative terminal that almost no one monitored. They were quiet, businesslike, carrying nothing visible. They didn't speak as they passed him. They did not look at him. He might as well have been part of the wall. Silas kept moving. He emptied a trash bin. He refilled a paper towel dispenser. He did not stop or turn around, but he noted the time. He noted the door they used. And he noted that the secondary access terminal, which he had seen the building systems technician working on 3 weeks earlier, connected to a maintenance logging system that the custodial crew used to track cleaning schedules and room access, a piece of infrastructure so mundane that it had never been flagged as sensitive. In the nights that followed, he began to pay closer attention. A server monitor that should have gone dark at midnight was still running at 2 in the morning. The maintenance log showed repeated access to a corridor segment that had no scheduled repair work. When he checked the custodial database, something he had access to because his shift assignments were recorded there, he found entries that didn't match any work order he or his colleagues had been given. And then, almost by accident, he found the backup. The building's secondary data infrastructure ran an automatic synchronization to a redundant archive every night at 3:14 a.m. It was a legacy system, installed during an IT overhaul 6 years earlier, never decommissioned, rarely mentioned. The sync captured a window of activity that the primary server room's logs did not, specifically the activity in the secondary terminal between midnight and 3 a.m. Silas didn't understand most of the file types or the naming conventions. But he understood enough to see that there were entries in that archive, time-stamped, unedited, that recorded modifications to financial authorization records during hours when the building was supposed to be empty of executive staff. He copied what he could to a small USB drive he kept in his jacket pocket. An old one, scratched at one corner, that he normally used to transfer Bonnie's drawings from the library computer. He brought it home and set it on the kitchen counter and didn't open the files for 3 days. The news coverage of Vivian Hart's legal trouble was everywhere. He watched enough of it to understand that someone was being destroyed by exactly the kind of careful, deniable manipulation that left no obvious fingerprints. He didn't know Vivian Hart personally. He had seen her in the hallways. She was the kind of woman who moved through a building like she had somewhere important to be, which she usually did. She had never spoken to him. She had never been unkind. She had simply never looked. He sat with the USB drive for 3 more nights and could not make himself feel indifferent about what it might contain. The problem was everything attached to the decision. He was a night janitor. The man he was considering exposing was the CFO of the company that signed his paycheck. If he walked into a courtroom with a scratched USB drive and an account of what he'd seen in a maintenance log, the most charitable response he could hope for was polite dismissal. The less charitable responses involved losing his job, his income, his apartment, and Bonnie's stable routine, the thing he had spent 2 years constructing with the careful discipline of a man who knows that children need predictability more than they need almost anything else. He stopped sleeping properly. He lost track of conversations. Bonnie noticed on the 3rd day, which told him she had probably noticed on the 1st. They were in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening, Bonnie in her pajamas with the small stuffed rabbit she had named Gregory, for reasons she had never fully explained. Silas was sitting at the counter, not looking at anything in particular. Bonnie came and stood beside him and leaned against his arm in the way she did when she had decided something needed to be said. She asked why he was sad. He told her he wasn't sad, just thinking. She said that was the same thing when he did it. He didn't argue. Instead, after a moment, he asked her something he hadn't planned to ask. Not in those words, not to a 6-year-old. He asked her what she thought a person should do if they knew something true, but telling it might make things hard for them. Bonnie thought about it the way she thought about everything, with her head tilted and a rabbit held against her chest. Then she said quietly, in that even voice children have when they haven't yet learned to soften the things they mean, If people who are good keep losing because bad people are louder, then when I grow up, what am I supposed to believe in? Silas looked at her for a long moment. He didn't answer that night. But the next morning he got up before his alarm, put on the cleanest version of his uniform, and picked up the USB drive from the counter. He called the school to say Bonnie would be slightly late. He called his supervisor to say he needed a personal morning. He looked up the courthouse address, wrote it on a slip of paper, and folded it into his breast pocket. Then he took Bonnie's hand, and they walked to the car together in the early gray of a Seattle morning. Back in the courtroom, time was running out in ways that Andrea Brooks could feel in her chest. She had requested additional time to review 2 exhibits. The motion was denied. She had flagged a potential chain of custody issue with one of the authorization records. Martin's team had produced a supplemental affidavit within 40 minutes that cleanly addressed it. Every move she made was anticipated. Every gap she found had already been filled. The case had been built by someone who knew exactly how Andrea Brooks argued, which meant it had been built by someone who had spent time understanding the company's legal strategy from the inside. The judge was not hostile, but he was visibly losing patience with a defense that kept promising pivotal evidence and delivering procedural challenges. He had made 2 remarks about the efficiency of the proceedings. Both were polite. Both were warnings. Martin made his closing statement in the measured, sorrowful register he had perfected over the course of the trial. He said Vivian Hart was not a malicious person. He said she was a gifted young woman who had been given too much authority too quickly, in a field where the temptations of power are considerable and the guardrails must be robust. He said the board had failed her by not building better accountability structures. He said all of this with the expression of a man accepting shared responsibility, which made it, in its way, the most devastating thing he could have said about her. Vivian sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her knuckles were white. Andrea leaned over and said this was likely their last window. Did Vivian want to make a closing statement on her own behalf? Vivian was about to stand when the rear doors of the courtroom opened. The sound was small. A single door on weighted hinges, pushed open with deliberate care. It was the kind of sound that shouldn't have carried over the low ambient noise of a full courtroom, but it did, because timing has its own acoustics, and what happened in the next 3 seconds was the kind of thing that changes the air pressure in a room. Silas Monroe walked in. He was wearing his work uniform, the gray-blue shirt with the building services emblem on the left chest, the kind of fabric that absorbs a shift's worth of labor and still looks exactly like what it is. His shoes had a faint trace of floor cleaner at the sole edge. He held Bonnie's hand in his left hand. She was wearing her school coat and carrying Gregory the rabbit under her right arm, looking around the courtroom with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who understands that this is somewhere important without knowing quite why. In his right hand, he held a small USB drive with a scratch on one corner. The contrast was almost architectural. On one side of the room, tailored suits, leather portfolios, digital displays, and the accumulated machinery of institutional power. At the back door, a 33-year-old janitor in a work uniform, a 6-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit, and a piece of outdated storage media that had probably never been used for anything more significant than Bonnie's drawings. Several people in the gallery recognized him from the building. A quiet exchange of glances began to move through the rows. Martin Keller turned and looked. Whatever he saw in Silas Monroe's face, or more likely, whatever he failed to see that he expected, shifted something behind his composure for just a moment. Then the composure reassembled, and he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Are we now entertaining testimony from the janitorial staff?" The contempt in the question was so complete and so unhurried that it had the opposite of its intended effect. The room didn't laugh with Martin. The room went very quiet. Silas did not respond to the remark. He looked down briefly and adjusted the collar of Bonnie's coat. Then he looked directly at the judge and asked, in a voice that was level and clear and entirely unadorned, whether he might be permitted to submit evidence that had not yet been entered into the record. Andrea Brooks was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Vivian turned in her chair. She looked at the man standing at the back of the room, and something happened that she couldn't quite name yet, a recognition that arrived without context, the way you sometimes remember a face without being able to place where you've seen it. She had walked past this man dozens of times. She knew that with the strange certainty of someone who had never once actually looked at him. The judge deliberated for 60 seconds. The lateness of the submission was a problem. But Andrea's argument was crisp. If the evidence was germane and had not been available to the defense prior to this session, procedural rules allowed for a discretionary exception. The judge granted a review. Silas was directed to the witness stand. He settled into the chair without rushing. He set the USB drive on the edge of the rail. He did not look at Martin. He did not look at the gallery. He looked at the judge and began to speak. He said he had been a member of the night building services crew at Hart Biotech for close to 2 years. He described his assignment: the finance wing, the 14th floor, the secondary server corridor. He described what he had observed on the night of the 22nd of the previous month. Martin Keller and 2 board members accessing the secondary server room through the maintenance override panel, outside of any authorized hours, without any authority registered on the primary access log. He described the maintenance sync archive, a legacy backup system that ran automatically each night and recorded activity in the secondary terminal during hours when the primary system had logged no entries. He explained what he had found there, in language that was plain and specific and limited to exactly what he understood. He said he was not a technology specialist. He said he did not have a degree in anything that would make a courtroom take his word on data architecture. He said all he knew was what a man learns from 2 years of working the same floors at the same hours: which lights should be on, which doors should be closed, which terminals should be dark, and which timestamps should not exist. Then he set the USB drive on the evidence table. The room was no longer the room it had been 10 minutes ago. The court's technical consultant connected the drive to a review terminal. The contents were projected onto the display screen that had, for the past 2 hours, been showing Martin Keller's carefully curated evidence against Vivian Hart. The first file was a segment of footage from the building's secondary maintenance camera, a unit mounted in the utility corridor outside the server room, installed not as a security measure, but as part of the building's climate monitoring infrastructure, and therefore not routed through the same security management system that had conveniently produced a gap in its records for the relevant evening. The footage was timestamped. It showed Martin Keller and 2 board members entering the secondary server room at 11:52 p.m. on 3 separate occasions across a 5-week span. The second set of files was extracted from the legacy sync archive. These were operation logs, records of the secondary terminal's activity during the hours in question, showing a series of file access events, modification timestamps, and credential insertions that did not originate from any workstation assigned to Vivian Hart or her executive staff. The credential trail led to an administrative override account that had been dormant for 4 years and reactivated quietly 7 weeks before the first allegations surfaced. Andrea moved immediately. She requested a side-by-side timestamp comparison with the primary system's records, the records that had formed the core of the prosecution's evidence. The comparison was generated in under 4 minutes by the court's technical team. The timestamps did not match. The financial authorization records attributed to Vivian Hart had been entered into the primary system at times that were inconsistent with the secondary terminal's activity log, the log that was never meant to be found, because nobody looks at the maintenance sync archive of a legacy backup system that hasn't been mentioned in an IAT meeting in 6 years. Martin Keller's legal team requested time to prepare a response. They argued that the secondary system's data integrity could not be verified without independent forensic analysis. The court's technical consultant was asked directly, did the data show evidence of post hoc modification? The answer came back without hesitation. The archive's checksum records were intact. The timestamps were internally consistent. The data had not been altered after the point of capture. Andrea built on it cleanly, She asked why the primary security camera system had produced a complete data gap for exactly those corridor segments during exactly those hours, while the climate monitoring camera, a secondary unrelated infrastructure unit, had captured continuous footage throughout the same period. She asked who would have had both the access and the knowledge to suppress one system without realizing the other existed. She let the question sit in the air of the courtroom for a long time. Martin Keller was still at his table. The composure was there, technically. The lines of his face were still organized into something that resembled control. But the quality had changed. It was no longer the composure of a man overseeing a process he had designed. It was the composure of a man holding himself in place by force of habit, while the foundation beneath him gave way. One of the two board members who had been present in the security footage stood abruptly and said something to his attorney that nobody in the gallery could hear but everyone could read in the urgency of his hands. The other sat very still and stared at the table with the expression of a person deciding which version of the truth to start believing in. Constance Hale, in her seat 3 rows back, had gone completely still. Her hands were in her lap. Her eyes were forward. Whatever she was processing in that silence was too large and too complicated to show on her face, and she had enough self-command not to let it spill. But anyone who had known her for more than a year would have recognized the specific quality of her stillness as the stillness of someone who has just understood something they should have understood much earlier. The judge suspended the proceedings. He directed the bailiff to secure Martin Keller pending an emergency review of the new evidence. He indicated that the charges against Vivian Hart would be placed in abeyance pending a full forensic audit of the secondary archive data. He said this in the flat, procedural language that courtrooms use for moments of consequence, which somehow made it sound more final than any dramatic pronouncement could have. Martin Keller was escorted from the courtroom with his wrists bound in front of him. He walked the way men like him walk when they have no other option, deliberately, without looking at the faces turned toward him, as though the loss of the room's admiration is a thing to be endured rather than acknowledged. He passed within 10 feet of the defendant's table. He did not look at Vivian. The gallery erupted in the low, disorganized noise of a room full of people, trying to process something faster than comprehension allows. Cameras clicked. Reporters began moving. Andrea Brooks pressed both palms flat on the table and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 hours. And Vivian Hart sat without moving. She did not cry immediately. She did not stand or turn to accept the attention that was now shifting toward her in waves. She sat in the same straight-backed posture she had maintained all morning, in the red dress she had chosen because she refused to look like someone who had already given up, and she felt the room change around her the way temperature changes. Not all at once, but in a spreading, gradual transformation that starts at the edges and moves inward until the whole space is different. The look in her eyes shifted. Before, for weeks, for months, it had been the look of a person who has decided to absorb an injustice with every gram of dignity they have left, because that is the last thing no one can take from them. Now it was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name but felt like the moment a person who has been holding their breath realizes they are allowed to breathe. She turned, finally, and looked toward the back of the room. Silas Monroe was no longer at the witness stand. He had stepped down quietly, the way he did everything, without claiming more space than the moment required. He was standing near the rear wall, one hand resting on Bonnie's shoulder, watching the room with the steady, undemonstrative attention of a man who has done what he came to do. It was the first time Vivian had looked at him and actually seen him. She found him outside, on the wide stone steps that faced the street. He was sitting on the lower step at Bonnie's level, his knees bent, holding open a small package of crackers. Bonnie was eating them one at a time with great concentration, Gregory the rabbit propped against her knee. The noise and motion of the building behind them, the reporters, the attorneys, the clamor of a verdict that hadn't finished resolving itself, might as well have been in a different city. Vivian stood at the top of the steps and looked at them for a moment before she walked down. She had said thank you to many people in her professional life. She had said it with varying degrees of meaning. She did not know how to say it now with anywhere near the weight that it carried, and the realization of that gap stopped her for a second when she reached the step where Silas was sitting, and he looked up at her. He stood. She said his name, and then found she didn't have an organized sentence to follow it with. She said, "I don't know how to begin to—" He shook his head slightly. Not dismissively. Just the small, honest gesture of a man who is genuinely uncomfortable with gratitude at a scale he doesn't know how to hold. She asked him why he had done it, why he had taken the risk, why he had brought Bonnie into that room and stood up in front of everyone who would have found it easy, natural, even, to dismiss everything he said before he finished saying it. Silas glanced down at Bonnie, who had looked up from her crackers and was now watching both of them with the patient, unfiltered attention of a child who knows something significant is being said, even if she can't track all the words. Then he looked back at Vivian and said, in the same plain, unhurried voice he had used at the witness stand, "Because my daughter needs to grow up in a world where the truth still has someone standing on its side." Vivian Hart had not cried in the courtroom. She had not cried when the board voted to suspend her. She had not cried when she saw her father's name in the prosecution's opening statement as the provenance of the company she was accused of stealing from. She cried now, on the courthouse steps in the gray Seattle morning, in a way that was not theatrical and not anguished, the particular private release of a person who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. She told him that she had spent 3 years convincing herself that she had to be impenetrable, that the only way to protect what her father had built was to build a version of herself that couldn't be touched. She said the hardest part of the past months wasn't the accusations or the public humiliation. It was discovering that the people she had believed were with her were in fact not. And then she said, "Quieter. The person who walked into that room today and gave me back my life is someone I walked past 100 times without ever stopping." Silas said he didn't think that was unusual. He said most people are too busy trying to hold on to the things they're responsible for to look up very often. He said it without judgment, as a statement of fact about the world rather than a comment on Vivian specifically. Bonnie, who had finished her crackers and grown tired of being excluded from the conversation, held one of the remaining crackers up toward Vivian without preamble, the way children offer things, completely, without condition, without requiring the recipient to have earned it. Vivian took it. She laughed, briefly, unexpectedly. The kind of laugh that happens when something catches you off guard in the middle of something heavy, and the contrast is so complete that the only response is laughter. She crouched down to Bonnie's level and said, "Thank you." Bonnie said, very seriously, that it was the last one, so Vivian should probably eat it. Vivian ate the cracker. And sitting on the cold courthouse steps with a 6-year-old and her father who had no idea what he had just set in motion, she felt something ease in her chest that hadn't eased in longer than she could precisely remember. She told Silas that she would not forget this morning. He nodded once, the way people nod when they understand something has been said and don't feel the need to add to it. Bonnie leaned against his arm. The city moved around all three of them with its ordinary, indifferent motion. The weeks that followed were the kind that transform the shape of a life without announcing themselves as significant while they're happening. The forensic audit was completed in 11 days. The results confirmed everything the secondary archive data had indicated. Martin Keller and the 2 board members had used the dormant administrative account to fabricate a series of financial records over a 7-week period, timing the releases to coincide with Vivian's signature on routine documents that could be plausibly recontextualized as approvals. The scheme was meticulous and, in its way, impressive, a testament to what a man with institutional access and decades of operational knowledge can build when his motivation is the removal of someone he finds intolerable. What it hadn't accounted for was the maintenance sink archive, because people who operate at the top of a system rarely consider the infrastructure maintained by people who operate at its base. The charges against Vivian were formally dropped. Martin Keller and the 2 board members were indicted on multiple counts of corporate fraud and evidence fabrication. The proceedings would take another year to resolve, but the public conclusion was swift. The indictment landed on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday the tone of every major business publication that had spent 3 months anatomizing Vivian Hart's alleged downfall had been quietly, comprehensively revised. Constance Hale called Vivian privately before the formal reinstatement. She said what needed to be said, and Vivian accepted it with the generosity of a woman who had decided, somewhere on those courthouse steps, that the energy required to hold grievance was energy she no longer had a use for. The board conducted a full structural review. 3 resignations followed. Vivian was reinstated as CEO with a mandate to oversee the reforms she had been quietly designing since the day she walked out of the courtroom. The first thing she did when she returned to the building was ask building services to change the scheduling system for the night crew, so that the staff had proper break rooms on the floors they serviced, rather than in the basement. It was a small change that cost almost nothing. It was the first thing she thought of. The second thing she did was call a company-wide meeting for the following Friday. The meeting was held in Hart Biotech's main atrium, a large glass-ceilinged space that on ordinary days was used for product launches and investor briefings. On this Friday, the front 3 rows were reserved, not for board members or department heads or the senior leadership team. For the building services crew, the maintenance staff, the mailroom, the reception team on every floor, the people who ran the coffee stations and the loading dock and the after-hours security desk. Silas sat in the second row, between a colleague who ran the HVAC maintenance team and a woman who had worked the lobby reception desk for 14 years. He was in his regular clothes, a plain shirt, dark trousers, and he sat with his hands folded on his knees, in the posture of a man who is present, but not entirely comfortable with being centered. Vivian spoke for about 12 minutes. She talked about the company's founding and what her father had believed about the relationship between institutional power and institutional responsibility. She talked about what had happened over the preceding months, clearly and without the softening language of corporate communications. She talked about what the investigation had revealed, not just about the people who had built the scheme, but about the structural conditions that had made it possible for people at the top of an organization to assume that people at the bottom would never see anything worth reporting. And then she said Silas Monroe's name. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She said that a member of the company's night building services crew had walked into a federal courtroom carrying evidence that changed the outcome of a case that would have ended Hart Biotech's integrity and her own freedom. She said that he had done it not because of his position, not because of professional obligation, and not because he expected anything in return. She said that he had done it because he decided it was the right thing to do, and because he wanted his daughter to grow up believing that the right thing still had consequences in the world. She said, if a company can only see the people sitting at its highest table, it will be blind to the most important truths it possesses. The room was quiet for a moment after that. Then it wasn't. Bonnie, who had been brought to the meeting by Silas because school was not in session that day, heard the applause and looked up at her father with an expression that was equal parts pride and bewilderment. She whispered, "Are they clapping for you?" He said yes. She seemed to think this was correct and appropriate, and she clapped too, with the serious, deliberate enthusiasm that 6-year-olds bring to things they have decided matter. In the months that followed, the distance between 2 very different lives began to close, in the gradual, unannounced way that real things close. Vivian approached Silas with a role in the company's operations division, not a title, not a promotion in the way that word usually functions in corporate environments, but a position that used what he actually knew: systems, patterns, the operational logic of a building that most people in senior positions never think about. He didn't say yes immediately. He said he wanted to think about it, because he didn't want anyone to believe that he had done what he'd done in that courtroom as a transaction. Vivian said she understood that, and she said she would have thought less of him if he had agreed immediately. They left it open. Hart Biotech launched a new research ethics fund in the name of Vivian's father, designed to support transparency in internal governance and to fund a fellowship program for first-generation professionals entering the biotechnology field. Vivian announced it at a small internal ceremony, in the same atrium where she had spoken on the Friday of the all-staff meeting, and this time the front rows were again reserved for the people who were usually last. Silas came with Bonnie, who had at some point decided that Vivian was a person she approved of, on the grounds that Vivian listened when Bonnie talked and didn't use the simplified, slightly patronizing register that adults often adopt with children they don't know well. Bonnie had specific standards for adults, and Vivian had met them without appearing to try. There was an evening, sometime in the weeks around the fund launch, when Vivian ended up at Silas's apartment for dinner. It happened practically rather than romantically, Bonnie had asked, with the uncalculating directness of a child who does not yet understand why adults complicate invitations, whether Vivian wanted to come for pasta. Silas had looked at Bonnie and then at Vivian with an expression somewhere between apologetic and resigned. Vivian had said she would love to. The apartment was smaller than any space she had spent a significant evening in for years. The table fit 3 people comfortably if no one needed a lot of elbow room. Bonnie narrated the pasta preparation with great authority. Silas moved around the kitchen with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who has cooked in that space several thousand times. There was no performance in it. There was no accommodation for the strangeness of having a CEO at the kitchen table. There was just pasta, and a child who had opinions about the correct ratio of butter to garlic, and an evening that asked nothing of anyone. Vivian sat at that small table, and felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of, the particular, inarticulate warmth of being in a place where nothing is being managed, where no version of herself was required. She watched Silas show Bonnie how to test whether the pasta was done, and she thought about all the evenings she had spent in the past 3 years in rooms that were much larger and much emptier than this one, wearing versions of herself that fit the room rather than the person. She thought about the courthouse steps, and the cracker, and the thing he had said about the truth needing someone to stand on its side. She thought about her father, and what he had believed about the people a company is made of. She thought about the 11 months she had spent being certain that the only protection available to her was the kind she could build herself. She hadn't been entirely wrong. But she hadn't been entirely right either. At the end of the ceremony for the Ethics Fund, after the remarks were finished, and the room had relaxed into the informal motion of an event winding down, Bonnie crossed the atrium floor with the particular purposeful stride of a child who has decided where she is going and why. She took Vivian's hand without asking. It was not a significant gesture in the way that Bonnie intended it. It was just the natural extension of a 6-year-old's comfort with a person she had decided she trusted. But it landed differently than it was intended, the way small true things often do. Vivian looked down at Bonnie's hand in hers. Then she looked across the room at Silas, who was watching them with the calm, unguarded expression of a man who has stopped trying to predict what comes next, and found to his surprise that this is not as uncomfortable as he expected. They did not say anything to each other across that distance. They didn't need to. Some things communicate more clearly at a remove than they would up close. Vivian had believed, for a long time, that what saved a person in the hardest moments was power or resources, or the quality of the professionals in her corner. She had built her professional life around that belief, and it had served her well enough, right up until the moment when none of those things were sufficient. What had actually saved her was the conscience of a man that an entire building had learned not to see. A man who had carried a scratched USB drive onto a witness stand because his daughter asked a question he could not answer any other way. Sometimes the person who walks into your life at the moment when everything else has already been taken from you brings more than evidence. They bring proof, in the only form that really holds, that the world still contains people worth believing in. And sometimes, not always, not automatically, but sometimes, that is the beginning of something neither of them had the vocabulary for yet, but which both of them, in their different ways, had stopped being afraid to want.